Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. In the often difficult and sometimes dangerous relations that embroil the United States and North Korea, a simple fact stands at the crux of the matter. North Korea remains, in its methods and motives, a place of great mystery, one whose policies often seem maddeningly calculated to confound expectation and frustrate design. Because the past bears so directly upon the future, we would do well to consider both the history and strategy of this distinctive land, one whose ambitions, for good or ill, directly affect our own. From such consideration will come the insight that can best guide our diplomatic approach. My guests are Kathryn Weathersby, Senior Associate with the Cold War International History Project of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and James Goodby, Senior Fellow at the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Weathersby, Ambassador Goodby, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a subject.
Yes.
Right.
And let's start with the history of it. In this particular, Kathryn, I think we'd all agree that nations are always shaped by their historical experience. And it's that experience that North Korea's had that maybe many of us don't know much about. And from what I've gathered, Kathryn, a lot of it seems to center around a sense on the North Korean side that they've been regularly hurt, even betrayed, by both allies and adversaries. Now that's a sweeping generalization, but is there truth to it?
Yes, that's exactly how I would put it. Their historical experience has been very difficult, and I think very clearly shapes how they approach the six-party talks, but also how they think about possessing nuclear weapons and all other aspects of their security needs.
And it's also true, Kathryn, is it that not just their adversaries or those they've been in opposition with, but even those on their side, so to speak, in the old communist days gave them heartburn, if you will, in
Yes.
a sense of being difficult to deal with, and I use the word betrayal?
Yes, absolutely. We've been doing research on the history of North Korea's relations with its allies through the archives of those former allies, which are now open or partially open to researchers. And the story that's coming out of those archives is really quite remarkable. It's very dramatic, and it is one of a very difficult relationship that North Korea had with its Soviet patron and protector, its Chinese patron and protector, and all of the smaller countries of the communist world.
We're going to get into that. Would the word multilateralism fit in that context, Kathryn? Could we call in that communist era that a kind of a North Korean experience with, quote, multilateralism?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, the international community of the communist world was one of multilateral structures. Economic structures, security structures. They provided security for the countries within that community, and they also provided constraints.
Right. Jim Goodby, this is extremely interesting stuff. I'm sure you'll agree. And I sort of pressed Kathryn on that multilateral issue just because of the circumstances she described, which we'll get into in detail. But it suggests this to me, Jim, that North Korea, through many years, has had a very difficult relationship, friend and foe alike, and in a, quote, kind of multilateral way. But as the 21st century dawns, I think it's your position that it's going to be a new sense of multilateralism that offers the best hope for both them and us in terms of a better relationship. Now, tell me if that's right, and then if so, what kind of character will the new multilateralism have?
Yes, I do believe that we have to give up the old idea of the hub and spoke, the concept that was used in Northeast Asia almost throughout history. We have to give way to something new and different, and I think what we're talking about is a regional organization, perhaps modeled on the six-party talks now proceeding, which include, of course, North and South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, the United States. And I think the agenda for that kind of an organization has to include security, but I think it also has to include other things,
right,
cultural, economic, and so forth. it's going to take a little getting used to that kind of thing because it's never been done before.
Exactly, and it's going to have to be sensitive to the kind of history that Kathryn's talking about too,
right?
And meet the economic challenges of North Korea.
Yeah.
We're going to get deeply into the particulars of this new kind of multilateralism that you're proposing, Jim. But to give us further context for it, Kathryn, let's press ahead on this very intriguing history of North Korea. Going back to these kind of adversarial relationships, this sense of being abused or betrayed or so forth, is it fair also to think, though, that North Korea had a kind of a very unique posture within the communist world? Now, let me see if I can kind of both victim and champion. I'm thinking of the way the East Europeans and other communists would look upon this beleaguered component of their community. Is that a fair kind
I sometimes use the phrase poster child.
Poster child, there you have it. It was that.
Yes, because of the Korean War of 1950-53, which was so devastating. The American bombing of North Korea was so extensive and lasted for so long and was so extraordinarily destructive. North Korea gained a special status as victim of American imperialism, as it was called, and within the communist world. Also, the fact that the troops remained right on the other side of the border after the war, and indeed, of course, are still there, meant that North Korea remained the forward post of the communist world, directly confronting the forces of the other side. So for both of those reasons, it was the little state that everyone else had to support. They had to support, they had to prop it up, no matter how badly the North Koreans might behave.
This is interesting. Poster child indeed. And this last point you make, no matter how badly they might behave, the North Koreans seem to know that.
Yes.
And to play with it, did they not?
Yes.
I mean, I'm not going to call them the neighborhood extortionists, but they did know how to get what they, or try to get what they wanted. Right?
A nice way of putting it is using the leverage of the weak.
There you go.
Right. But yes, they absolutely became masters of using the leverage of the weak. And I think it's very useful for us to know that now, because they are certainly continuing to do this. Right. And I think it's important for us to understand that they have never interacted with another country in any other way. So if we are simply to tell them, stop doing this, that's not very helpful because there's nothing else in their repertoire.
This is a powerful point, the leverage of the, and they've always had to deal on that basis.
Yes. Yeah.
How does a diplomat make use of that, Jim?
Well, I think you have to recognize that is a fact of life. I think Kathryn's absolutely right about that, and you have to take that into account. You can't excuse bad behavior, but you have to understand there is a background to it and a rationale. Sometimes to us they seem irrational, but I think given the background and given the strategy they pursue, from their standpoint, there's a great deal of rationality in it.
Right, and we have to be sensitive to that.
Be sensitive to
the
it.
world as they see it that way. Again, Kathryn, one of the things, and I was absolutely fascinated by this in something you wrote, that many things bring this home to us. The Korean War, for example, there was considerable dissonance between Stalin and Kim Il-sung, the father. But is it correct the Russians didn't necessarily want the Korean War to end when the Koreans did? North Koreans did, is that right? Because it was a kind of poster child of its own for them.
Well, it was useful for them, yes, once it became safely a stalemate and the Chinese were holding the Americans back and there wasn't any chance that American forces were going to advance to the border. Then it became very useful from Stalin's point of view because it was weakening the United States, at least as he saw it. And because it was a wonderful intelligence gathering opportunity.
Right.
American military forces with all of their latest weaponry were right there. The Soviets could gather up the weapons that had been left behind in the battlefield, ship them back to Moscow and reverse engineer them, which they did.
So the North Koreans might have felt, you're getting all of this at the cost of our suffering in the war.
Yes.
Kind of
what we see from the documents is Kim starting to talk about wanting to bring the war to an end as early as February of 1952, almost a year and a half before the war actually ended. Stalin at that point pressing him to keep fighting. China at that point also wanting to keep fighting,
Yeah.
to position itself more favorably for the armistice. Finally, then the Chinese became willing to bring the war to an end. And then finally, when Stalin died, his successors no longer wanted to deal with this
Right.
situation.
You know, it's interesting also that in addition to this, and I think you've mentioned it even in this answer, that this Russians sort of doing what they felt they had to do and via Korea, so to speak. The Chinese, who did enter the war,
Right.
but became quickly an overbearing presence, I thought, in many ways for the North Koreans, and therefore also difficult to deal with. So, I mean, this is revelatory to me. Once again, even with their allies, they've had this sense of pressure.
Yes, we tend to think now that China is the key to solving the North Korean problem. If only the Chinese will use their influence over the North Koreans, they can force them to do what we want them to do. However, as we look at their relationship, we see that for the North Koreans, the Chinese always represented a threat. China has been the hegemon of the region for, of course, centuries upon centuries. That's the first reason.
Right.
Secondly, the strongest rivals to Kim within the party, within North Korea, were those who had strong ties to China and had fought with the Chinese during the Chinese Civil War.
Right.
And so Chinese influence also then threatened Kim's political hold.
What about American influence? And let me turn to you, Jim Goodby, on this one, because after the Korean War, of course, our troop presence in South Korea and our alliance with South Korea was an extraordinarily important factor for everyone, and certainly for the North Koreans as well. And I know I'm making heroic leaps here in terms of eras and so forth, but there comes a time, I think, I'm trying to place it, and maybe you can help me, perhaps in the early 60s, when or I guess this is the question, do we get a kind of a strengthening, a more adamant North Korean stance? And I guess the symbol of all of this is at what point do they get interested in nuclear weapons for the first time? Where do you see this sort of, we must be strong, we must go it alone, we must be prepared to deal with these things?
Well, they started a nuclear program, not nuclear weapons, but a nuclear program in 1952 during the Korean War.
Right.
And you can understand why they might, because there was a lot of talk about our using nuclear weapons in Korea at that time. I don't think there was ever any serious plan to do that, but from the North Korean perspective, they probably understood that there would be a possible use of nuclear weapons, so it made sense. They didn't really get active in a serious way until the 70s and 80s, and I think by 1980 they perhaps had decided a nuclear weapon was not a bad idea, but I don't think they ever crossed the Rubicon in the sense that they couldn't go back and give it up. And the big issue and big question mark now is whether they have finally crossed the Rubicon in the past year or two.
But as that progressed, were they, even their interest in things nuclear, was that a direct reaction to our presence? Or both of you can contribute to that.
I think, well, George, every small country has to have a strategy of survival, because the survival of a small country is not a given, unlike the survival of a big place like China, India, Russia, and so forth. And the strategy for survival that I think North Korea adopted was one of presenting a kind of a threat, if you will, to the outside world. They wanted to be understood to be stronger than they were. And in fact, for a while, they were quite a strong country, and their economic program, of course, led them into a position of weakness. But they never wanted to demonstrate that they're weak, and they want to show how powerful they are. The nuclear bomb idea fits into that.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. And as they, got that kind of that sense of wanting to both be strong and appear strong, and all things are ultimately are personal in politics. I mean, it's a question also of what leaders believe. Kathryn, did Kim Il-sung get that kind of sense from Stalin too? And I think he was very influenced by Stalin's sense of what made a powerful country, that you sort of had to, present yourself boldly to the world? I mean, or what precisely did he get? What were the kinds of things that Kim Il-sung derived from his admiration?
Stalin was certainly his mentor. And it's quite clear that he learned from Stalin how to establish control domestically. He used Stalin's methods to establish control and maintain control within North Korea. He also took on Stalin's assumptions about the hostility of the outside world, of the capitalist world. However, he also had the absolutely devastating experience of Stalin, his great mentor, whom he revered, being willing to sacrifice North Korea entirely rather than enter the war himself. One of the most surprising records that has, for me, that has come out of the Russian archives is the documentation of how when the Chinese initially, on October 13, 1950, cabled to Moscow that they would not, after all, be able to enter the war on behalf of North Korea. This is as UN troops were advancing very rapidly into the north, and the state was about to collapse. Stalin sent back to North Korea an order to Kim Il-sung to evacuate his remaining troops from the country. So he was given an order directly by Stalin to withdraw from his country entirely. The Soviets were not going to send troops, no matter what, because he did not want to fight the Americans directly. The very next day, the Chinese changed their minds, sent another cable to Moscow. Stalin sent a cable back to North Korea, reversing the evacuation order. But from the records I've looked at, it looks like that was absolutely traumatic for Kim, which is certainly easy to understand. So the only conclusion he could draw from that is that he really could not depend on any other country for the security of his regime, the survival of his country. He would have to do whatever it took to be able to defend his country himself. North Korea hence became extraordinarily militarized, among the most militarized countries in the world.
I very deeply appreciate that, Kathryn, because this sets me up, all of us up, but everything makes us all very thoughtful too, and really sets up a question, Jim, that I'm thinking about as Kathryn asked. This is Kim Il-sung's experience, and it is bitter. I think that's a very modest interpretation of it. To what extent does it become a kind of a driving influence on Kim Il-jung, the man, his son, the man now currently leading North Korea? How much of what we're talking about, to put it directly, is inherited and becomes kind of the working ethos of the North Korean approach we're still dealing with?
Well, there are reports that Kim Jong-il, the son, has a different attitude from his father, but I think you have to assume that there was a great deal of inheritance. And I would only say one thing, George. The North Koreans are Koreans. That is to say, South Korea and North Korea share thousands of years of common heritage and experience. So they're not totally different nations. Some of their ethos and the way they approach the outside world is shared. And I think that the general attitude that Kim Jong-il has towards the world is shaped probably more by the historical experience of Korea over centuries rather than simply his father.
Well, you know, and given the little bit, and it is a very little bit that I know about Korea, that I think is absolutely on target. I think of Juche, as they call it, this
Juche, self-reliance.
Self-reliance, and it's really characterized, among the many things, they characterize them. Jim Goodby, against this kind of background, and so much else can be said about all of what we're talking about, but to focus on what we said at the very outset, the idea now of introducing a kind of a new multilateral approach to things, a very different set of actors in a very different era. How do we go about that? What would it accomplish? What would you see it being and doing?
Well, I think the problem that we have in Korea is that there has been a focus, in my mind, too narrowly on the nuclear issue. Thanks to you, George, we haven't yet talked about nuclear issues, but And we shouldn't talk exclusively about them. I think the fundamental problem is how do you go about integrating North Korea into a broader community? I think there are some indications that Kim Jong-il has that in mind, on his own terms, of course. And I think the only way to end the constant crises in North Korea is to integrate North Korea economically, culturally, and every other way. And that's what I think about when I talk about a multilateral approach.
Let me quote you to you, Jim. Today, unlike any other part of the globe, Northeast Asia has no permanent organization dedicated to peace and progress in that specific region. So are we talking about the kind of thing we see in Europe, NATO, other arrangements that are pretty common throughout the world?
Yeah, there are a lot of models. There are models, for example, in Southeast Asia, the system there, the ASEAN it's called, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which could be applied in Northeast Asia. The model I happen to like, because I spent a lot of time working on it, is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
OSCE.
OSCE. And that has a broad agenda. It includes all the things that I think ought to be on the agenda: economic, cultural, political, security. It's something that the South Koreans at least think about when they talk about regional security. And incidentally, the important September 19, 2005 Statement of Principles included the idea of some sort of an approach that the South Koreans interpret, at least, as something on the order of a regional security organization. So it's on the agenda now.
What would happen, Jim? Let's introduce the nuclear question right now in this way. What would happen if the nuclear impasse, so to speak, in all of its formulations, kept North Korea from joining what you're advocating? Suppose we had there's 6 countries that could participate in this. North Korea we're talking about right now, but suppose they didn't want to play. Would it still be worthwhile to do it?
Absolutely. The only question is whether the South Koreans would be willing to proceed without North Korea. And you could say the same for China. They have the feeling that you have to include North Korea at every step of the way, and there's logic in that, of course. But I would argue that these countries have much to gain from this kind of collaboration, and if North Korea doesn't want to join in, then they shouldn't be allowed to block progress towards that kind of integration, which in time I think would basically suck North Korea into it.
They should go ahead, and even with ad hoc steps.
I think so, absolutely.
Kathryn Weathersby, with your historian's hat on, and so how do you think this would play? How do you overcome what I would think might be North Korean wariness? I mean, what makes Jim's, I think, very, very, very appealing idea work?
Multilateralism could provide a way for North Korea to, hedge its bets. I mean, so not rely exclusively on an agreement reached with the United States or an agreement we reached with South Korea or any other country. But so it spreads the risk is one way it could be presented to them, and one way they are likely to regard it. After all, they balanced the Soviet Union and China off one another for decades successfully to get what they needed. This gives them 5 countries, to sort of play off of each other, but also they could position themselves, as they did with Russia and China, in such a way that none of the countries involved would be likely to do something the North Koreans felt was very disadvantageous because of the likely effect it would have on their relations with others within this multilateral structure. For example, in the years of the Sino-Soviet split, neither side was willing to push too hard on North Korea for fear that it would go completely into the other's camp in that rift. So that gave it, quite a lot of leverage.
Right.
It, I would think, would be likely to perceive this in a similar way. Now, it's something new and strange because this would be crossing all kinds of ideological boundaries, and that would be odd. Cultural boundaries, and so this would be new territory, but the basic principle of playing states off one another in order to provide your security, I think would be very agreeable to them. And of course, this is what a small state like Korea has always done. I mean, South Korea would look at it this way as well.
I find that very helpful and very hopeful. And it makes me mindful, Jim, of a phrase you use called the hinge time, that if we're trying to do this kind of thing, this is the time to advance it. And I guess the question then, Jim, and the question we may close this part of our conversation on, I look forward to having us all come back and talk about this, because this is something we're going to keep watch on for quite some time. What's the American role in this, Jim? Is it the prime mover? Is it, follow? And we're not accustomed to playing follow the leader, but what do we do?
Well, a couple of things I think can be said. Picking up on what Kathryn just said, it's interesting that when the former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung went to Pyongyang in 2000 to meet with Kim Jong-il, he reported to us that Kim Jong-il said he wouldn't mind having American forces stay in Korea even after unification. Interesting point given the hostility. And why did he say that? Because Korea has a long history of being victimized by its neighbors, both Japan and China. And they see the United States, and I think North Korea sees this as well. They see the United States as a force that could offset the influence of these big neighbors. The faraway enemy is better than the close enemies, if you will. So there's that point in it. As to the role of the United States otherwise, I think this kind of approach will not prosper unless we push it. Because it takes our leadership to get something done on that scale. It is a pretty big thing because historically it's not been done before.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you because I think you've opened my eyes and increased my understanding, I think, of all of our viewers as well. And I'll just actually use a word that I think Kathryn, I know Kathryn's used, I'm sure you have, Jim, too, that the importance of verification in whatever is ever agreed to is probably a confidence builder for all concerned as these things progress. Thank you both very, very much.
You're welcome.
George.
And I really do look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you have been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching. And thank you both.